Hello and welcome. This is Wilrens for Create a Learning Site, the place to go deeper in your understanding of the Bible. Last year, in February, I wrote about my intention to read the New Testament in Greek and report regularly on Tumblr and other social media on my progress. So, how did I do? Well, life happened. To be more precise, we unexpectedly decided to buy a house and move country, which made much of the year look very different from anything that we had anticipated or planned for 2016. As a consequence, you can see that here, I haven't published on Tumblr in months. That's the price we paid for moving. However, I have made progress in my reading, even if not as fast as I had hoped. By the end of the year, I made it to Colossians, and when this issue comes online, I should be reading the book of Revelation. So it's taking me a few months more, but the end is in sight, and I should be able to finish soon. I also wrote last year that I would do this with the help of Logos Bible software, which is what you see here. On the right is the text of the Greek New Testament, and on the left I have a lexicon, a Greek lexicon open. Now, this proved to be a winner. I could not have done it within this time frame without Logos. It's awesome to just click on a word and instantly get its meaning, presbyteros, elder, and an analysis of its grammar. Let's take a verb here. Again, click and there's the meaning and the grammatical function or form explained. Now, I do have to admit that one can get overly dependent on these features. I would probably be more confident reading plain Greek text without helps if I had not used Logos. But I am learning a lot more in less time than if I had to page through a lexicon and the grammar all the time. And I'm much further along in my reading than I would have been otherwise. As for my reading proficiency, I did a little test in Matthew right at the beginning of my reading project, and at that time I needed about 25 minutes to read a chapter. This January I repeated the test with 2 Timothy and Philemon, and at that time I needed about 17 minutes to read a chapter. So I made some real progress in my reading proficiency in Greek. Here are some of my impressions on the individual books in the New Testament. I found Matthew and Mark quite readable. John, I would say, was even easy to read. Luke, on the other hand, was a real challenge, both in vocabulary and in sentence structure. And the same I found to be true for the book of Acts, not surprisingly, since it's by the same author. Clearly, Luke writes a more sophisticated Greek than the other evangelists. I knew this before, in theory, but now I have experienced it firsthand. I was surprised to find Romans and 1 Corinthians not that hard to read. I braced myself for my first encounter with Paul in Greek. My explanation is that the vocabulary of these two letters includes many theological terms that are discussed in the literature, so many of these Greek words were familiar to me. Plus, I spent a lot of time studying and teaching these two books, and so the text is familiar to me as well. I was surprised, however, to find that after this to find that 2 Corinthians was really tough again. This is a highly personal letter of Paul, with not that much theological vocabulary. So many of the words he uses were unfamiliar to me and I had to look them up. Now, contrast to this, Galatians down to Thessalonians proved relatively readable, familiar texts, familiar terms. The pastorals, on the other hand, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, were tough. Again, they contain a lot of vocabulary that does not appear elsewhere in Paul, and that does not necessarily consist of theological terms that are discussed in the literature, so I wasn't familiar with many of the words used. Philemon is an easy read, and then came Hebrews. This one was a tough book to read. I'd say the toughest in the Old Testament. Everything that came afterwards was quite okay, but Hebrews was a huge challenge. It too has its own vocabulary, and in addition, its author exploits the potential of the Greek language for dense and complex constructions. One has to pay close attention to know which phrase or clause goes with which subject or object. It's quite a puzzle. It gave me a new and first-hand appreciation for the argument that Paul cannot have been the author of this book because of the Greek used. It's not simply the difference in terminology. It's not that hard to adjust your vocabulary to changing contexts. But there was much else that was also new to me and different and took time to figure out. The author of Hebrews constructs his sentences in a different way from Paul in all of his letters. One takeaway from this project for me is the conclusion that our Bible translations are actually pretty good. The translations that I'm familiar with do not often appear to be poor or even worse, wrong. I did occasionally wonder why translators changed the tense of a verb or chose a word that's different from the more obvious translation of a Greek word used. But these departures from the text did not lead to major differences in meaning. Reading the Greek text did add precision and depth, however, and above all, force. Now that's pretty subjective, of course, but I experienced it this way. These words in Greek are so powerful, and they come with a precision and nuance that's often hard to catch in a translation. One way this precision and depth comes about is by combining words. The most common form is to add one or two prepositions, attachments, to modify the meaning of the original term, sometimes in subtle ways. Now, this also happens in English, of course, but not as often. Let me give you two examples of this. The first example is from 2 Timothy 3 verse 16. All scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness. Now, I'm still in Logos Bible software, and I'm now using a reverse interlinear. A regular interlinear gives you the Greek text and then the English words that are used to translate the Greek text. In a reverse interlinear, like we have here, we have the English text, but it gives us the Greek words behind each English word. Marked here is the word correction, sometimes also translated improvement. And it shows in the bottom which Greek word is used here, and that's the word I'm after. Here. epanorthosis. Now, this noun derives from the word orthos, which means straight, both in a literal and in a metaphorical sense, so it can also mean true or correct or right. And to this adjective, two prepositions are added. First, epi, which can mean on or above, but can also be used for movement or aim. And then the preposition ana, which means upward or anew, but can also in a subtle way modify the meaning of a word that's not always easy to define. Now, together, these three make up a new word that's stronger than the original. It has a clear positive, in a sense, upward connotation. It's not just making something straight, it's making it better. Therefore, also improvement as a possible translation here. The second example is from Titus chapter 3. In verse 8 and 9, Paul makes a contrast. On the one hand, he tells believers to avoid certain things, such as foolish controversies. And on the other hand, he calls on them to devote themselves to good works. Now, that's a contrast, obvious enough, but it's even clearer in the Greek, because Paul uses two verbs that are derived from the same main verb. This verb is histemi, which means to stand, and again, in each case, a prefix, a preposition is added to it. When it's about devoting, here devoting to good works, the prefix is pro, which means for or before, and it refers to adopting a positive stance towards something. Therefore, devote. Avoid is also derived from the verb histemi, but now the preposition is peri, which means something like around. This gives the word a negative connotation. It's a negative stance. To stand around means to do nothing with the object or to avoid whatever the object is. Now, in Greek, the contrast is quite explicit and obvious. It's a play on words, which is lost in translation, of course. Reading the text in Greek, then, does not usually lead to a different meaning, but it frequently leads to a deeper or more nuanced understanding of what is being said. Doing this has given me a fresh and intense encounter with the text. I loved it. So, what is next? Well, the obvious answer would be the Old Testament, but I fear that my Hebrew needs some serious work before I can do that. However, there is the ancient translation of the Old Testament into Greek, the Septuagint. This was the Bible of the early church. It would be an intriguing exercise to read those books in the version they used. I haven't decided yet. My aim in doing this issue on my reading project is not to get you to read the Greek New Testament as well, unless this is something you'd really like to do and you feel ready for it. But perhaps there's something else you'd like to learn or read. a subject or question you'd like to consider and learn about, a book that you could read that would be a bit, not too much of a stretch. How about choosing a learning project of your own, however small, to create your own learning site? I think it would be worth it.
The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments.